Welcome to the Exhorter podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Our aim is to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. We have an interesting topic today. John, I understand we're talking about locusts. Is that true?
Yes, locusts. The plagues.
Oh, we're going to the book of Joel then?
Book of Joel. No, actually, we're going to get into the topic here in just a second. But first, I want to ask you some questions. And these questions are about how we view the world around us, okay, and how we interact in the world around us. So I'm going to ask a few of these questions to the guys here. And if you're at home, feel free to join along. Just go ahead and kind of raise your hand or think or acknowledge that you do agree with that. That's how you think, okay?
Disclaimer, if you're driving, please keep one hand on the steering wheel.
One hand on the steering wheel. All right, let's get started. Raise your hand. No matter what I do, some people will never like you. Raise your hand if you agree with that. I have control over my life. People get what they deserve in life. The world is run by a few powerful people. Most problems have a way of solving themselves. I am not superstitious. I'm a little stitious. Practice makes perfect. People are born with certain talents. Most things in people's lives happen because of chance. Career success often happens because someone knows the right people. I solve my own problems. I believe in fate. I am often blamed for things that are not my fault. Anyone can rise to the top with enough hard work and determination. I earn the respect of others. Being successful is a result of hard work. Sometimes I feel I don't have control in my life. I can accomplish goals I set for myself. Okay, so that was a lot of questions. Thank you for participating in that. So what was the point of that? Well, we've all probably met someone in our life that was truly inspiring. You know, we looked up to them. They seemed to have their life figured out. They seemed to be confident and determined. And sometimes we've met people who seem to have buried themselves into a hole that they can't get out of, unable to see the opportunities presented to them. Maybe they seem to harbor a lot of negativity in their life. I'm going to bring in Star Wars a little early here. And one of the characters in Star Wars always kind of reminds me of this. Here's a quote from him. Sir, the possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1. Who said that?
C-3PO.
C-3PO. Yes. Okay. Now, I would classify C-3PO as having a negative perspective about life, maybe a really rational or realistic perspective in most of his quotes. Always bringing up the odds, even when he's told to not tell them the odds, right? So what that thinking can relate to is a topic called locus of control, not locusts, as you mentioned, but locus of control. And we had this discussion in the high school class a while back, and I walked them through the same exercise we just did. And it was quite interesting how many of them had sometimes a very negative outlook on life or focus. So before we go any further, do you guys know what locus of control means?
I do, but I don't know how to explain it.
Kyle, I know we've talked about this before. I know you probably have an idea, right? Because I tend to bring this up a lot in our conversations. I'm generally fascinated by psychology, always interested in knowing more about how God made our brain. Let's define locus of control a little bit. And essentially, locus of control is a measure of how much agency we believe we have over our life. The idea of this is how much of your life experience is based upon the choices you make versus luck or circumstances happening outside of your control.
Right. So C-3PO would have that external locus of control.
Correct.
Your circumstances are dictated by the external odds, whereas Han Solo would have that internal, don't tell me the odds, never tell me the odds. You know, he's in control. He'll get through it regardless of the odds. So that would be that internal locus of control, if I'm understanding this correct.
That's correct. Internal and external are the two types of locus of control, and they're two ways of thinking and viewing the world. And one is thought of as better than the other, but it's kind of like a continuum or a spectrum. You're not always going to be on one side or the other in your thinking. And I'll explain a little bit more.
Could I be somewhere in the middle, kind of like a gray Jedi?
Sure. Yeah, you could be a gray Jedi. Somewhere in between, if that was a thing. Yeah.
Qui-Gon.
Qui-Gon. Okay. So let's define the two terms a little bit more. We'll start with external locus of control. Generally, someone with an external locus of control believes that most of things in life happen outside of their own control. What you get or achieve in life has very little to do with you, but mostly comes from external influences, things happening to you. Usually pessimistic about most things, often feel victimized. They have trouble recovering from setbacks that happen to them in life. Here are some statements very similar to the ones we started with in the beginning that someone with an external locus of control might make. I often feel I have no control over my life and the things that happen to me. There's really no point in trying because people don't get what they deserve. There's really no use in making goals or plans because something inevitably goes wrong. There's something I can't do because I will get too stressed out and won't be able to do it. And if someone thinks of me negatively, I'm going to feel terrible and it's going to ruin my day. Or if someone says something negative towards me, I'm going to have a bad day. Now, I tend to sometimes be this way when I'm going on a trip. I don't really get excited for the trip until my feet are like on the ground and I'm actually there because, sometimes you think anything could happen, to derail this plan, right? Have you all ever uttered any of these kind of statements in your head? Does this hit close to home at all to you?
Yeah, because I spend a lot of my time trying to help people to change. I mean, the whole idea of Christianity is transformation, right? A radical transformation. And so as a preacher, that's kind of how I spend my time, is trying to help people transform. And it's frustrating because that old saying that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior proves to be true so often that I want to bang my head against a wall sometimes trying to get people to make positive changes in their life. And sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. And I find myself wondering how can I possibly be effective at this? I can't control what somebody chooses or thinks or decisions they make in their life.
So I find myself thinking about the apostles as an example. They're given a mission of something to do. Jesus talks to them and says, hey, you're going to spread the word over the entire world. And wasn't what they expected, but I'm imagining how they thought it was going to be versus how it actually was. And if you would have told them, or Jesus did say it was not going to be easy, but the things that they had to do. So the way I think about it is, yeah, there have been times, especially when a lot of things happen that are bad all around the same time. Or there's the old feeling of, it sometimes seems like those who are evil have all these good things happening and those who are good. And how do you really have control? So for me, it kind of goes back to the passage in James, James chapter 4 and verse 15, where you're really asking the question, if the Lord wills, this will happen. But that's an attitude of complete trust and reliance on him. And I admit there's times, especially when things have been going rough, or I feel like I'm trying to do what God says and things are not happening in the way I would hope they would, that it's easy to question that.
Yeah, I don't think most people have a doubt of God and God's ability, but I do think we often doubt ourselves and we have a doubt in our own ability. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to understand and recognize that we're born with the ability to make choices and we have the agency to change things in our life, and we are not helpless. And that kind of leads us into the idea of internal locus of control. Now, I said that I don't think that we often doubt God, but, in some cases, I think we do. In having doubt about our own abilities, we are doubting God's creation, what God has created us with the ability to do, the free will, the mindset, the ability to make choices. And so in some case there, we are doubting God's power. Now, there are some other factors that go along with this idea of external locus of control, and they're usually anxiety and depression. And they're tied because those conditions generally make us feel helpless, hopeless, and sometimes just stuck. And that's generally why it's not a good place to be in an external locus of control mindset.
And that's kind of what I was thinking, John, is I can think of times in my life where I felt like, okay, I'm in this situation. It's a really tough situation. What does the Bible say to do? And I try to do every one of them to the best of my ability. And months or years go by, and I'm looking, and maybe the situation has gotten worse. And it's easy at times to, and of course I look at some of the Psalms, and I kind of see the Psalms often saying the same thing. Lord, I've done what you said, yet all this is happening. Where are you? And do I really have the opportunity, to your point, to control my destiny? Or as Gandalf said, since you guys brought in Star Wars, right?
Here we go.
Time for Lord of the Rings, right? All we have to do is to decide what to do with the time that is given to us. That's all we have.
Well, that really brings up the idea of managing your expectations here, because I find that it's learning to find that balance between recognizing what I can't necessarily control and differentiating that from what I can control, because there is a lot of circumstance that is beyond your control. But in any given circumstance, you always can control your reaction to it, for example. So oftentimes it's not so black and white. It's that there's some aspects of a situation I can totally control myself, my reaction, my attitude. There are some things I cannot control, the way someone else responds, someone else's attitudes, someone else's behavior, or bigger things than myself, such as the laws that govern this land. There's laws that I would love to see changed, but beyond casting a vote for someone that, a politician that
politician you might not 100% align with.
Yeah. But beyond casting a vote, I really feel powerless to change some of the laws that govern this land. So at any given situation, there are things I can control. There are things that I can't. And it's learning to acknowledge the difference between the two, accepting the things I can't control, but learning to take ownership of that which I can, which usually is myself. I can control myself.
And that leads us into the internal locus of control. This is usually defined by not thinking you have control over everything in your life, but that you are in charge of your life and in charge of the choices you make. You believe in your own ability to work with what you've got. This mindset also believes that you have control over the way that you think and feel, no matter what is said to you and what is thought about you. Usually this person is pretty optimistic. They can recover quickly from setbacks in their life, and generally will take responsibility for things that they have or don't have. Now, being 100% on the side of internal locus of control and being so confident in yourself can sometimes not be good, because you kind of remove God from the situation there. You think you are in control of everything, and you don't need God at all. Because we do need to rely on God. We need to rely on something outside of ourselves. The reason why it's generally better to have an internal locus of control is because it would support the outcomes we have for ourselves and the goals we have for ourselves, and allow us to move forward in our lives. If you have an internal locus of control, you might make statements like, I can put forth the effort, be intentional and successful in life with my actions. So things don't have to go my way. People don't have to be a certain way in order for me to be okay. I don't always have control over my circumstances, but I do always have choices in them. I am the one in control of my mind and emotions. It's not others that have control over my mind and emotions. And I know what to do to get what I want in my life. Generally, this starts about how we feel about ourselves, how secure we are and who we are. We know what our limitations, we know what our abilities are in life.
You know who comes to my mind when you describe what you just described there with the internal locus of control? Joseph, right? Because there was a lot that he could not control, what his brothers did to him. Now, some of that you could argue he brought that on himself for talking about his dreams and being his dad's favorite, but he couldn't control that his brothers sold him as a slave. But when he was in Potiphar's house, he seemed to work very hard and was acknowledged for that hard work and rewarded by being given a pretty high position within Potiphar's house. And as much as he tried, he couldn't control Potiphar's wife. So he controlled himself and chose to remove himself from that horrible situation by running. And then he ended up in prison, in the dungeon. Couldn't control that circumstance, but he kept his head up. And I always find it remarkable that in the dungeon, he sees these people here, the baker and the cupbearer, and asks them, what's wrong with you? Why do you look so sad today? Well, they're in a dungeon. Of course they're going to be sad. And he's in the same dungeon. So why does he care about other people's problems when he's there himself? Because he's acknowledging that he still has some control over himself in that situation.
It's not just pure optimism, because at the end of the story, when he has the opportunity to smite his brothers to get his payback, he takes responsibility for the way that, he's not going to let these people change who he is and change who he knows he needs to be. He has control over what he does and how he acts towards them in this situation. And at that point, he chooses mercy. He chooses grace on them.
Yeah, you meant it for evil, but God meant this for good. And he says, that's how I'm choosing to see this scenario. It showed that he put his faith in God. So there were things he could control all along the way. He controlled himself. He controlled his reactions. He couldn't control the circumstances or necessarily the setting in which he found himself, whether it was Potiphar's house or prison, but he chose to do the best and be the best version of himself in that scenario that he couldn't control because he trusted in God. And that's what he revealed at the end of the story. God meant it for good. And so I had my trust in God all along.
Now, the reason why I really wanted to talk about this is I hear so often from people these phrases of an external locus of control, people giving up their ability of being in control of their circumstances in life, sometimes relinquishing the ability to make these decisions and have control over their emotions outside of how people make them feel. And I always just want to reach out and say, that you have to switch your mindset. You have to start thinking more positive about your ability and your control over your own life. You have the ability to make these choices and to have the perspective of the world around you that you want to have.
What I think of, John, we've all heard the quote, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. That's an old quote, but when thinking, Kyle, you were mentioning a biblical example. For me, it's the Apostle Paul. You think of somebody who is in prison and he's writing the book of Philippians, and yet he's talking about rejoicing. But he says something really interesting, kind of like what you were just saying, John. He says, well, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you've revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. And he talks, he's in a tough spot. But the key is verse 11. He says, not that I speak from want, for I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot in that book about just the sufficiency of what he's gained in Christ. And that changed his attitude in whatever circumstance he was in.
And that's what I mean by, a lot of this is how you perceive yourself. And if you see yourself with this negative mindset, it's really hard to see any positivity in your life. So I think of songs like, Count Your Blessings, songs that humble you and make you think of how much control you have over how much you do have in life and how much control you do have over your life. Some people go through practices where they journal or they identify all the blessings they have in their life. These things help with that little mental switch on how we choose to perceive the world around us. Is it easy to flip that switch? No, it's not always easy to flip that switch. Sometimes it's easier for others to flip the switch, but we can't ever think that switch has been removed from us and we do not have access to that. Now, one of the things that's really important is having support in this. This is really difficult to do in isolation, having support in this, having friends, people that will help support you. You can vocalize your thoughts and feelings and emotions, and they can kind of be a good sounding board back. Because whenever you talk to a friend about something you feel lacking in your life, a lot of times they'll kind of lift your thoughts and spirits, and they'll allow you to see what you don't see in yourself. So I think it's really important just not to try to handle these things in ourselves. We are given relationships in our lives that support us in times like this.
Well, and one of the simplest answers, like Joseph, or even like Paul, the examples we brought up, is turning to God in prayer. Another good example is David. King David had a lot of things going on in his life that he could not control. He had a lot of enemies. He couldn't control them. Sometimes he felt overwhelmed. But what he would do is he would pray. He would write these psalms. He would turn his attention to God, like Psalm 59, deliver me from my enemies, O my God, defend me from those who rise up against me. He would dedicate entire psalms to the idea of, I feel like I'm overwhelmed in circumstances I can't control or challenged by forces that are greater than myself, but I can still turn to God. He controlled his reaction by choosing faith in the highest power.
So let's bring this back down a little more personal. How do you guys deal with this? Do you guys deal with these kinds of struggles? If it is a scale, do you find yourself one day on one side of the locus and the other side of the locus? How do we deal with these things in our lives?
Well, to be real, I'll also speak to when I struggled with this. In the book of Hebrews, it talks about fixing our eyes on Jesus. And really that's the key. But for me, when I stopped doing that and I was going through very tough times in my life, maybe the toughest, where I started to fail from that perspective was when I started comparing what was going on in my life with others. And so for me, examples of that would be things I never expected. Some of early in my life, I went through the pain of divorce, and it was something that I never expected to happen to me. It was, one of the toughest parts of my life. But when you're going through that, it's easy to look at where you're at and look at others and think, I'm not happy with that. Or when my son Scott was born, it was a shock, that he was born with disabilities. And at the time, I didn't really even know what it was going to be. But as time went on, it was easy to compare where he was at with where someone who didn't have those challenges were. And you can be discouraged by doing that instead of having a different perspective. So for me, that's being real about the opposite of what I should have been doing. And it didn't work, instead of staying focused on this attitude that Paul talked about. And ironically, those circumstances, God knew, made me stronger and made me better. And I'm thankful that I'm stronger because of it. But at the time, I wasn't focused on that.
Yeah, people are in really different places with this. I think one of my struggles is I tend to seem very optimistic and be good at this on the outside. I'll kind of rush in there and say, okay, let's solve the problem. Let's see if we can get this fixed. And a lot of the times it's kind of like if you build it, they will come. If I talk a good game on the surface level of being very optimistic, I'll then afterwards kind of have to convince myself to follow through with that and to reassure myself, okay, yes, you can do this. So I tend to front that a little bit more on the outside and then kind of have to convince myself later on that that's the case. And I'm trying to start a better practice of that. But, surface level can look a little different sometimes. I don't think that anyone doesn't deal with this. And I don't think anyone's perfect at this either. I think everyone is somewhere in between, flexing back and forth. I just tend to try to lean that way first, lean more towards an internal locus.
Well, it sounds to me like what you're describing is faith. And that's my reaction, is trying to differentiate. And that's how I try and analyze a situation. What is out of my control? And then it's about praying to God. Like the Psalms I mentioned of David, there were things out of his control. Hand those over to God. And so I try to differentiate and acknowledge what is out of my control, what is beyond my power to influence directly. And I'll try to turn that over to God by prayer and by trust and faith. And so you talked about that. I try to have a positive attitude, even though I'm not sure how it's going to go. Well, that to me sounds like faith in some respects. And so I just try to acknowledge, what can I control now? What's out of my control versus what can I control? And that's where I start to get practical. And that doesn't always come naturally or easy, but I try to take a very logical approach to these situations or to discouragement. And I just try to analyze it. What can I control? What can I not control? And when it comes down to what I can control, myself, my attitude, the words I choose to say to this person.
One of the reasons I tend to lean in on the internal locus is my wife depends on me to do that sometimes. She has some severe anxiety, and she relies on me. Mental health is one of those topics that we're going to talk about here soon. It's really important. The way I think about it is if I have the ability to lean in towards more an internal locus of control, then I try to do it a lot to support her and help identify those things that she has control, I have control over, and to try to make the world a little easier to deal with. And that's kind of what I mean by seeking support from others or being a support for others in this, affirming people's ability to make choices and to have control over their life.
Well, I can give some examples too to further illustrate the way I try to approach these situations. Evangelism is one practical application of this. It's about planting seeds. You remember the parable of the sower and the soil. There's different types of soil. Or you can think about the illustration that Paul uses in the 1 Corinthian letter that I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. I can't control how people react to the word of God, which is the seed that I am trying to plant within their heart. I cannot control whether it bears fruit. That is up to them. That is up to God. But I can control whether I'm planting the seed. And when it comes to things I can't control, their reaction, I pray. I turn it over to God. I pray that when I plant the seed, people will consider the message, that people will acknowledge, that people's hearts will be softened, but that's out of my control. But I should not become discouraged. And just because I might preach and preach and preach and preach and people don't listen, or I'm trying to reach lost souls and they don't listen, I shouldn't get this attitude that therefore it's totally out of my control. And there's that external locus of control. I can't do anything to save people, so I'm not even going to try. That's where you get kind of a defeatist or negative attitude. I maintain control, even if it's discouraging. I feel like no one's listening, no one's being saved. I have to recognize my part, and what I can control is to keep preaching, keep planting, and do that in faith and hand over the rest to God in prayer and confidence.
You know, John, I think about what you just said a moment ago when you were talking about you come across a certain way, but sometimes on the inside there's still struggles and you convince yourself to make sure you feel that way. That resonated with me because I was just the example I was mentioning when my son Scott was born. I go into I'm the father, I'm the husband, I am the encourager. It's going to be okay. I have to show strength. And I remember when that happened, I was overwhelmed with people coming in, doctors and nurses, and I learned what a genetic counselor is. I didn't need any of that. I didn't need them all coming to me, but I was overwhelmed with people and I was comforting family. It's going to be fine. We're going to be okay. But I remember I finally had a moment where nobody was in the room. And it was just me. And I finally kind of got to deal with my own emotions and kind of broke down a little bit. And right then, the genetic counselor came again. Hey, can I help you? I'm like, no, please just leave me alone. I just need to deal with this for a minute. Somebody had given me a book about babies with Down syndrome. And at the time, I was just trying to didn't even know what all was facing me. But on the inside of one of the books was just a verse that really ratcheted me back to the attitude, Kyle, that you were talking about. And Jeremiah chapter 29 and 11, which is a well-known verse that we know, but it's, for I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Now, I don't know who wrote that. This was a used book, but somebody had put that verse handwritten in the front of that book. And for me, it's one of those moments in my life I'll never forget, because I'm not kidding you. I went from, really having tears to it was a turnaround of my attitude, and, really never looked back. But it was Jeremiah 29:11, and just that reminder that my life is in the hands of God, put it back with him. And my attitude about it completely changed at that moment. But I needed a reminder based on the emotion that was overcoming me at the moment.
Thanks for sharing that, Paul. One of the reasons why this is top of mind for me is in the high school class, we've been going through 1 Samuel. And instead of just going through 1 Samuel verse by verse, I wanted us to look at the people in 1 and 2 Samuel and identify the choices they made in their life in an effort to understand, how to make good choices, how to differentiate between the bad ones. But first, we need to start with this idea that, one, you do have the ability to make a choice in life. And I wanted the high schoolers to really sit in that and understand that more, because as we talked about with those initial phrases in the beginning of this episode, a lot of their hands were raised pretty high and had this external locus of control. Now they're young. They don't have a lot of opportunities out there yet to make a lot of decisions, but they absolutely have control over the way that they perceive the world around them, and they perceive their choices that they make, whether they are right and whether they are wrong. Now, this led into one of the most important choices we have in our life, which is the choice to follow Jesus. And we look in Matthew 7:13-14, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. There's a choice we have in life, a choice for salvation. We can take the narrow gate, take the wide gate. We do have these choices, and our salvation depends on us making those choices. And I think that's really the purpose of this conversation. It's not to think so much about ourselves and that we are completely reliant upon our own abilities and choices. It's just a focus that we do have the ability to make these choices, and we need God's help in making these choices. But at the end of the day, we have a choice to make. He wouldn't give us the free will to make choices if he didn't expect us to use it. One way or another, you're going to be making a choice, whether it is by doing nothing or doing something, right?
There's always going to be things you can't control. God is giving us the tools to cope with that by learning to control ourselves. Two scriptures that come to my mind, the whole book of Revelation. What is the whole point of that book? It was written to Christians that were going through the crucible of suffering, in a way, a form of persecution that 21st century American Christians can't even fathom. And what was the message to those Christians? Could they do a thing about it? Could they stop the Roman government from rounding up Christians and putting them on display as they were put to death in the Colosseum? Could they do a thing about that? Could they control that outcome? God says, I'll deal with that. Spoiler alert, he takes the dragon and the beast that represent Satan and Rome, and he deals with them eventually. But what is the message to the Christians going through the first couple centuries? Be faithful unto death, and you'll be victorious. You can't control what's happening to you, but you can control your attitude through it. And then as I think about some of the darkest chapters of my life where I was confused when my brother-in-law passed away a couple years ago at a very young age, it was the most challenging and darkest time in my life. And the scripture that I leaned on most was Romans chapter 12. It is the most basic description of how to behave as a Christian. Let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Again, that's learning to let go of things you can't control. What it describes here is simply being the kind of person you're supposed to be, even when you feel like bad things are happening. What's the point of being faithful to God? What's the point of walking the narrow way when it's led to pain and suffering, or when there's circumstances I can't control? And I look at a scripture like Romans 12 and hold on to that tightly when I don't know what to think, when I don't know how to feel, when I feel overwhelmed by circumstances in life. I look at this description of how I should behave, and I just try to do that. That's where my mind goes back to Joseph. I can't control what's happening to me. I can't control what did happen in the past, but I'm going to choose to behave the way a Christian should, and that's an act of faith in God.
I would just add when I think of this, I think of number one, we've just given some biblical examples of people that went through horrible things, and sometimes they talked about it directly. And you can look at that and realize you're not alone. You can look and read the Bible, which is full of imperfect people. And then look around you, look at your brethren, look at your church family, and realize there are people who have been through things that can encourage you, can talk to you. And I think we probably don't do that enough. Each of us kind of shared some difficult times that we had. But if you've been through something difficult, my wife is in Florida this weekend. It's been a year since her father passed away, my father-in-law. And John, I know you know the pain of losing a parent. You can talk to someone who's been through that, and there's something that you connect with because you've dealt with that pain. Or for me, with the examples that I gave, you're never alone in these things. And I think as a church family, we need to be more open with each other about these struggles, to encourage that with not just the attitude, but what we've each been through, we can get through these things together.
So to surmise, your view on your ability to have control in your life will affect how you cope with stress, how you will take charge of your life, and how you will ultimately walk the narrow path. If you tend to have a more external locus of control, it might help you to lean upon God's word, lean on God, lean on your Christian brethren, your friends, your family, rather than viewing yourself as a passive bystander. Think about actions you can take that will have an impact on the outcome that you're wanting.
Well, John, thank you for this topic. I'm still waiting to hear what locusts have to do with this, but I thought it was very interesting. Seriously, for you that are listening to this, if you have been dealing with things like this, I think you can tell you're not alone. But we thank you for joining us. Again, if you've got suggestions for topics or ideas, please email, let us know. Share this podcast. Go to our Facebook page, which features all of our episodes, but also a chance to comment and share. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you the next episode. That's my new is see you the next episode. That's my new thing.
In Acts chapter 13, we get Elymas the magician. This is an example I thought about bringing up. Paul could have just tolerated Elymas and his antagonism, but Paul chose to do something about it and blind him. And so I keep in mind that,
you'd always blind people.
I can always stab people's eyes out.
There's always something you can do.
If someone is opposing my preaching, I just stab their eyes out.
If it is to be, it's up to me. Oh, Kyle.